every win felt so personal to me and every loss felt deeply personal to me, as if it was my fault that this isn't going well. It's my fault that something was missed. It was my fault that I'm not carrying enough of it. And it felt like when I succeeded that it was a validation. Your job is not to carry the mission alone. Your job is to contribute to the ecosystem. And when I think about that realization and we think about that way of functioning, that realization alone changed the way that I personally thought about exhaustion. When the people carrying the mission collapse under all of the weight of it, when we suffer ourselves, then the mission suffers. And if we're honest, many movements have lost brilliant people because they were asked to carry way too much for too long. And if they stepped away from it, it was seen as for themselves and also because of the social conditioning that they're not doing enough. So the question I want to leave with you today is, how do we build movements that don't require martyrdom? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and here on Saturdays, we're going to do something just a little bit different called Solo Reframes. And these are going to be short reflections from my week, stories, observations, and moments that made me pause and see something in a different light, in a different way. And they come from my life as a third culture kid, my work as an organizational psychologist, studying human connection, empathy, culture, and my constant curiosity about what it really means to be human. Some weeks it's going to be stories that stayed with me, and other weeks it's going to be a question that I can't quite shake and I just want to share with everybody. But every reflection is an invitation to look at our lives, our relationships, and our communities with a little bit more honesty and perspective. So if you're ready for a thoughtful pause before the weekend begins, then let's begin, and welcome to Solo Reframes. Welcome back to another episode of Solo Reframes. I want to dig into a topic that I think is so important and so complex in the social good space, and that is about martyrdom, because it definitely exists. And I say this as someone who has lived deeply inside of that feeling of martyrdom. It's that feeling where when you care so deeply about making a difference, right, your exhaustion can get really complicated. And when you're building something meaningful, when you're trying to make life better for other people, where you're so committed to the cause, then this feeling of exhaustion that shows up, it doesn't show up regularly in ways that it may for other individuals. And that's because when we're involved in work that matters, when the mission feels really important, when it feels like the cause and what you're working towards is so much bigger than you, we start to tell ourselves a very different story about what it means to be exhausted when we're doing meaningful work. Because we start to call it's our responsibility. We start to call it dedication. We call it, well, that's just the weight of caring for others and for caring for this mission. And it's almost without realizing it, then exhaustion and burnout actually becomes proof that we care enough. Because if we're not tired, and if you're not stretched, and if you're not carrying something heavy, then maybe you're not doing enough. And that is something that we start to take on and start believing and conditioning ourselves in that space of, we care so much and so I've got to keep going. We care so much and it's my responsibility to show up because others are counting on me. And so that relationship that we have with martyrdom, with exhaustion, with burnout, with all of these pieces, they really get interconnected with each other. And so when we're in this meaningful space where we care deeply and our work impacts, actually creates deep impact, then it changes this relationship and that dynamic. And that belief runs so deep across almost every mission-driven space, right? It doesn't matter. That's the thing. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. It's about the individual. So you could be in mental health. You could be in education. You could be community building. You could be climate change. You could be human rights, public policy. You could be in technology. You could be an entrepreneur. You could be literally in any of those spaces. But that individual who believes that it's their core mission to be in that space, that psychology that shows up everywhere, and the longer I've worked with founders, with nonprofit leaders, with purpose-driven entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter, right? The more I've noticed the people doing the most meaningful work are often the most exhausted people in the room. And that tiredness often gets pushed to the side. And I started changing the way that I think about this and about what's been normalized in our industry and in our spaces. And I asked the question, what if exhaustion isn't proof of devotion? What if it's proof that something has gotten tangled in the way that we see our role in the work? So just hear me out for this example. It's a little bit of a stretch. Just hear me out here, right? So there's a subtle shift that happens when meaningful work becomes deeply personal for us, right? So when we see this work as an extension of who we are as a person. So the mission then, and that work that we're working towards, that mission stops being something that you contribute to, and it becomes something that you start carrying the weight of as a part of your identity. And so when that happens, what your brain is quietly fusing is your individual identity of who you are, right, with the outcome of the work. And so psychologists actually have a word for this. It's called identity fusion, right? So identity fusion is when your identity becomes so intertwined with a cause, a mission, with something else that separating yourself from it feels impossible. It feels like you don't even know how to fathom that, right? And when that happens, then something subtle but a bit dangerous creeps in for us, and which creates a space for that martyr complex. Because what happens here is, and I know that this sounds dramatic and I get it, but think about when you're in a space where you're doing the work, you're caring about the mission at hand, let's say you're a nonprofit founder and you have this deep mission about helping a specific group, and you're working in the education space and making sure that young girls continue to get education. Now you are so deeply engrossed into this, and it's no different than an entrepreneur or founder who treats their business like their baby, and it's their mission, and it's everything is just like, this is all encompassing. So that is what your life is about and what happens. But when you then tie your identity of who you are as just a person, right? Like, so me as Payal, and if I start to make my whole identity and my whole thing all about that, every part of my DNA is about the impact that I'm making with how many young girls get an education. Now, every win of that and every loss of that, I'm going to feel it very deeply, right? So when you think about that, it's like you start to notice, and it starts showing up in very subtle and quiet thoughts that happen, and it starts infiltrating your brain where you're like becoming even more and more deeply enmeshed with it. So it's like, so you're having thoughts like, well, if I don't do this, who will, right? Or like, I can't slow down right now. This is too important. The mission is bigger than me. Like, how can I take a pause? Like, I have to do this. The sense of urgency that shows up around this. And those thoughts, even though they're very noble and they sound like, yeah, of course I get it. And I'm sure many of you are nodding your head because you know that you've said those thoughts too. And you know those thoughts and feelings a little too well for yourself. What happens is they're also quietly placing the entire weight of this mission on you, the individual, on one human nervous system, which is not how change has ever happened, right? Like, we get in this false paradigm about it, but that's not how change happens. And I think part of why this happens has to do with something deeper. It's our relationship to chaos. It's our relationship to people pleasing. It's our relationship to what it's like to be in that constant state of urgency. And so I'm going to give this example that is a little out there, but just hang with me on this because I think you'll get what I'm trying to get to, right? So when I'm talking about that urgency, when I'm talking about that feeling of, until this matter is in a place of good, I can't stop. And I kind of compare it, and please call me out if you're like, what are you talking about, Payal? But I kind of consider it like when you're dating when you're younger, right? So you meet someone, the relationship is really intense. There's excitement, you're breaking up, you're getting back together, there's drama involved. It's not the drama, it's the emotion, right? It's the highs and lows that you are just tied to. And it's the potential of that person that you're seeing and what you can see that relationship could be. And ultimately, if that potential existed at all times, you know what is capable of that, right? So we've all had those kinds of experiences, and later in life, you enter a different kind of relationship where it's calmer and it's stable and it's, you still have disagreements in those relationships, but you work through them in a much more healthier capacity. There's trust in these relationships, there's consistency in this relationship, and there's safety. But when you enter that healthy safety relationship right after the chaotic one, a lot of times we interpret that as boring. We interpret that as not doing enough. There's something missing here. There's something that's not holding it together. But it's not, right? Nothing's actually missing in that. It's that we're emotionally wired to want chaos. And whatever reason that may be that has stemmed to get you into that place of wanting that chaos, it's the same thing that actually happens in our mission-driven work. And so it's the fact that we get accustomed to this urgency. We get accustomed to the pressure. We get accustomed to this constant space of dire. And that if there isn't dire, and if I'm not the one solving that, if I'm not the one who's there to help relieve this, then what are we doing, right? And so the calm begins to feel like I'm being complacent. So if things are quiet, if things are feeling stable, if I can take vacation, if I can go time, there's this guilt that gets associated with wait a second, something must be wrong if I'm not showing up in a way where I am constantly needed in order to make sure that this chaotic state doesn't stay stable. And so then that's where exhaustion becomes normalized because chaos becomes familiar. Urgency becomes familiar. We feel like, well, everything is on the shoulders of myself. And I know I felt this, and I'm curious if any of you have felt this too, because when I started doing work centered around impact and community, every win felt so personal to me and every loss felt deeply personal to me, as if it was my fault that this isn't going well. It's my fault that something was missed. It was my fault that I'm not carrying enough of it. And it felt like when I succeeded that it was a validation. And so if something was struggling, it felt like it was failure. But the more I cared and the harder I worked and the more I pushed myself, the more I told myself that slowing down wasn't an option. Because the thing is that when meaningful work has a very specific emotional pull to us. And so we're not just, optimizing logistics, or you're not just like selling a software product. You're trying to make people's lives better. And one can argue, logistics and all of the software is going to help make people's lives better. But when the stakes feel really, really high, just like for an ER doctor, then it feels wrong to rest. In fact, pause feels irresponsible. Stepping back feels like it's a betrayal of the mission, of the work. But what happens when you live in that space for too long, when you're living in that space of chaos for too long, when you're in that space of burnout and you're just pushing yourself, is that ultimately your body's going to give out, right? And you might even ask yourself, what's the point? Because you've been measuring yourself in this really exhausting place of I gotta win, I gotta loss, I gotta win, I got a loss. Those things then start to make you wonder, what am I even doing about this? And then it flips to how dare I even question the work? How dare I feel tired? How dare I consider stepping back when the mission is still very much necessary to complete? So then you push harder. And that's the cycle, and that's that trap that we get involved in. Because when meaningful work becomes our identity, when we have this identity infusion, stepping back feels like you're abandoning who you actually are. So there was something that helped me begin to reframe this. I started to think about this. I zoomed out for myself and I think about let's look at almost any meaningful shift that has happened in society. And we know that it happens rarely. It takes time. So let's take something that's more recent in modern history, very recent. Let's take mental health, for example, right? My first career path was I was a clinical therapist, former clinical therapist, worked in nonprofit settings, did home-based counseling, all of that. That was when I entered in 2010, 2009 is when I was in that space. And I remember at that time, mental health was still very taboo. It was still considered very much of I don't know about this. It's only meant for people you would hear those people who'd say oh my gosh, I totally believe in mental health. It's good for you to have it, but I don't need it. I'm good. We're good, right? And it's usually those people who are the ones that we actually need to have in therapy oftentimes. Anyways, so we look at mental health. And so not so long ago, right? In those early 2000s, people whispered about going to therapy. It wasn't as easily accepted. It wasn't as openly discussed. It was something that you still did on the DL. It was something that you still treaded with. Insurance didn't really cover it well. It was expensive. And it certainly wasn't something that companies were building billion-dollar platforms around. Yet, fast forward 20 years now, we have venture-backed mental health companies. We have therapy apps. We have democratized therapy. We have normalized it so much. Corporate offers mental health as benefits. Insurance covers mental health sessions. Entire industries build around emotional well-being. It's become a huge, huge industry, right? And now there's plenty of conversation to be had about the ethics of these venture-backed mental health platforms, but I'm not going there. That's going to be a digression. But the point is that the cultural shift happened, and it didn't happen in a month, in a year, in 5 years. It took decades. If we even think about it from when the birth of modern psychology happened in the, early 40s and 50s to now, right? Then you can say that it took like 60, 70 years to get to this point. So we expect this transformation on this cycle that is fast and moving at a pace because we want to see that. But cultural change operates on generational timelines, on movements, on community, on coalition. It's one step at a time. So when people are contributing small pieces over time, which means something important, then that's where we can really look at this and reframe this as your job is not to carry the mission alone. Your job is to contribute to the ecosystem. And when I think about that realization and we think about that way of functioning, right? That realization alone changed the way that I personally thought about exhaustion, because detaching myself from that identity of the outcome of the work, it doesn't weaken my commitment. It may be that it may take 20, 30 years to get to where I see this vision happening, but I get to be a part of a community that's working towards it. And it really strengthens our ability to sustain our momentum to be in that place. So when we stop centering ourselves in every win and every loss, we actually also become better collaborators. We become better strategists and better systems thinkers and better contributors, because with every win and every loss, we're not so centered on how this impacts my identity and how I'm existing within it. The work is meant to outlive us. So with this meaningful change and what it requires, we can think about it as what athletes do. They train, they play, they rest, they rotate. Every player has a role, and every player knows that they are contributing to something bigger than themselves. So in our mission-driven work, if we see that as no one player is expected to carry the entire team forever, we all have our place, we all have those moments, and that's how we're able to feel more into the mission-driven spaces. That's how we're able to feel more work. It's not about martyrdom. It's not about I need to carry the weight. It's about what is my part and what is my role in this larger goal and this mission. And then that burnout and that cynicism and that exhaustion, it can start to release itself. It's not about people caring too little, right? It's not because we don't care enough. In fact, it's about recognizing that in order for me to have the fuel to keep going and caring about this work, then I need to provide that rest to myself. And it's not about who's the bigger martyr in all of this. Whether it's in technology, education, mental health, whether it's community building, it doesn't matter how this shows up. So the strategy about all of this is not about how quickly can we move through this. It's about designing systems that protect us, the humans doing the work. Because when the people carrying the mission collapse under all of the weight of it, when we suffer ourselves, then the mission suffers. And if we're honest, many movements have lost brilliant people because they were asked to carry way too much for too long. And if they stepped away from it, it was seen as for themselves, and also because of the social conditioning that they're not doing enough. So the question I want to leave with you today is, how do we build movements that don't require martyrdom? How do we build impact that doesn't depend on one person burning themselves out to keep the mission alive? How do we make sure that we're not just saying that, of course, we have to rest, of course, we have to make sure we take breaks, but we're creating a space and we can contribute to an ecosystem without trying to become the ecosystem, without fusing our identity with this. And so when we have that capacity and we also not just preach it, but we practice it, then that longevity that we are creating for Changemakers, we're giving permission to each one of us to hold space. We're giving permission to say, hey, you know what? Take that break. I'm going to step in for this moment. You know what? We've got people coming through. You're good right now. Thank you so much for how much you've helped. When we normalize this a little bit more, I do think that we can remove the martyrdom that we hold on to really proudly in order to keep showing up. And I think that that is what we have to really ask ourselves, is how much martyrdom do we really need to keep in our industry, in our spaces, before we recognize how this is actually the thing that's causing us and preventing us from having people that we really want in the space to really show up and continue to show up, because the work is what matters. The mission is what is important. And it's so much bigger than the weight that one person should be even asked to hold. And I don't think it's something that we're doing outwardly or we're saying to each other in a certain way, but I think it's something that's felt. So a few things I want to leave you with, as I mentioned, is just really asking yourselves, like, how do I separate myself from the identity fusion of the work and the mission that matters and the way that I need to show up in this? And how do I create an ecosystem and a space where people are able to hold both of I'm care and I'm committed to the mission, and it's okay for me to take rest. And me working to the end of me is not going to be the reason why I end up burning myself out and not being able to contribute to this. Because ultimately, if we stay in that place of martyrdom, if we continue to fuse that feeling of burnout and exhaustion is a reward, then we're actually making everything about ourselves and not necessarily about the work at hand. So that's what I want to leave you with today. The Solo Reframe insight for today is, how can we really start to diffuse the relationship between doing meaningful work and holding the space of what it means to be exhausted, and allow ourselves space to actually hold space for each other so we don't lean into this martyrdom as a reward. Hi friends, I have a favor to ask you. If you're enjoying these episodes, then I'd really love it if you could subscribe, leave a review, or share it with your friends and family. Your words help others discover that the stories and these episodes exist in the perspectives that we're exploring over here. And the more that we can grow, the more feedback that we get from you through those reviews, the more we can make sure that we're creating meaningful episodes that you want to listen to. You have no idea how much this helps and how much I appreciate you for doing this. So if you don't mind, whether it's following us, subscribing, hitting the button below, if you can leave a review for us, or if you just share this with your friends and family, the episodes that you think that they would really resonate with, it means more to us than you can imagine. Thank you so much.